Hi there, I'm Vlad and I'm a Lightroom nerd. Today I want to show you how to make your own Lightroom tools that are just Lightroom presets that will improve your Lightroom editing workflow and help you achieve a few special effects. And if you don't want to spend the time creating them, you can buy them on my website. And one more thing, I have timestamps so you can jump from one tip to another if you already know about the one that I'm talking about. And we're going to start with a really basic one. This one I call the visual helper. And what it does is turning the photo black and white without affecting any of my previous edits. This way, I can add some masking that's affecting the exposure and get a much better composition without my eyes being influenced by the color contrast in the photo. And when I'm done, I have another preset that will turn the visual helper off. This method does have a few limitations. For example, on this image here that's completely edited, if I apply the visual helper, you're gonna see that I'm getting a bit of a bluish tone. And that happens because I do have settings in my curves panel and in my color grading wheels. That's just the way Lightroom works, where masks are applied first and then comes the curves panel and the color grading wheels. But I still have a better understanding of my image compared to its version with all the colors in it. And also, this tool makes it much easier to spot blemishes on the skin. Just turn it on and we can use the remove tool to remove any skin imperfections, and when we're done, visual helper off, and we have the photo back in full color. And to create this visual helper, all I have to do is create a new mask, use a linear gradient, make sure I cover my entire photo with it, and then go to saturation, drag it to -100, and the secret sauce is setting the amount to 200. And we're doing this to make sure that if we added any kind of saturation in the previous mask, we're not seeing that color shine through this one. Now, all that's left to do is create a preset, make sure we only check our last mask, and click create. And while I previously knew about the idea of turning a photo black and white to get a better understanding of the values, I have to say that I've caught myself using this tool a lot since I've created. You can make it yourself or support the work that I do by buying it on my website. While the first one was just a workflow adjustment that will help you get better exposure in your shots, this next one is called Color Boost and you'll leave in at the end of your edit. This one is creating a color range based mask. Then you can click and then select what color or range of colors you want to boost in your final image. As you can see here, if I'm selecting the highlights or the colors in my face, everything around it is gonna go a bit darker. And that's because if you drop the exposures of all the tones in a photo except one or a few tones, that tone will appear more vibrant and saturated and will be the focus of the photo. And that's exactly what my tool is doing. I'm using a color range mask and I'm selecting the tone that I want to boost, invert the mask, and then I'm dropping the exposure slightly, the highlights, and the shadows as well, but I'm also going to decrease the contrast in that area so it doesn't appear too punchy. And of course, the numbers that you see here are just a suggestion and you can play around with them for your own preference. But I would rather suggest you to go low on these numbers and then, after you saved it as a preset, you can play with the mouse slider of that preset, and that way you can adjust the intensity of the effect. And as a bonus tip here, I have both H and O binding to my mouse. O on the keyboard is showing the mask overlay, and H is hiding or showing these little markers that indicate where you have your mask. This way I can select what color or colors I want to boost, and I don't have to worry that all those markers are interfering with what I'm seeing in my photo. Now let me show you one more example to see the tool in action. I'm gonna click on my forehead and the green aqua tones are gonna be boosted. You can see that they appear brighter and more vibrant. And now I'm going to click on the orange on the side of my face, and you can see how the focus in the photo totally shifted. It's an interesting tool, and of course, some of you are gonna say, hey, but if you want vibrance or saturation, why aren't you just using the point color or the HSL? And that's a great question. And for a fair comparison, I'm gonna use my color booster preset. I'm going to select the forehead over here with lots of aqua tones, and I'm going to save a snapshot of this photo and call it color booster. Now let's delete the mask. And instead of using this, I'm going to boost the saturation of the aqua tones in the photo using the HSL. You can see how fast I can create some tears in the color over here because admittedly I've gone pretty far with the saturation, but let's save this as well, call it HSL, and now on your screen you can see both of the version one next to the other. And as you can see on your screens, the results are pretty different. One is creating a bit more tearing, the other one is lowering the exposure in the entire image, and you'll have to compensate for that. But it's one way to make a color pop in your photo. And I would strongly encourage you to give it a try and mess around with this technique as well. In the meantime, I'm gonna shift my focus to a tool that I'm calling Defocus. And no, we're not changing the focus point or anything like that. I'm just calling it defocus, while in reality I'm playing with the sharpening slider. And I'm not even playing with the sharpening over here in the details panel. I usually have this one turned off, and instead I'm applying my Lightroom tool called defocus, which is applying a mask and lowering the sharpening to -100. And as you can see, my photo got pretty blurry really fast. And now I'm gonna play with the mount slider and drag it down to around 10 or 15%. And then I'm going to apply grain. And this way, the smallest particle of grain in the photo is not bigger than some of the details in the photo. And the grain is gonna look way more natural if you have a bit of sharpness decrease across the entire photo. And that's not all. This is also a great tool for when you're shooting with small cameras that have small sensors. Those small sensors have a really hard time capturing details in the foliage, like you'd see in the photo that I've shown in the example before. This one was shot on a Sony camera that's pocketable, and as you can see in the grass over here, there is not a ton of details. So with my defocusing tool, I'm covering up the lack of details with even less details, but the photo looks way more organic and natural this way, and the final photo is more pleasing to look at. And at a certain degree, you can even simulate depth of field with a technique like this, with a linear gradient mask that is going from the edge of the photo, but don't exaggerate on that thing. And in the meantime, let me show you how I create this tool inside of Lightroom. We're going to masking, linear gradient, make sure that we're covering the entire image by dragging outside of it and checking with the overlay. Now I'm scrolling down in the mask and applying sharpness -100 over here, and we can probably experiment with noise reduction and some war and defringing control as well, but I'm gonna limit myself to sharpness today. And all I have to do now is create preset, check everything off, and make sure that I check the defocus mask. And after saving my preset, I can come in here to the amount slider, and the amount is gonna be how many points of sharpness I'm taking away from the photo. So amount 20 is basically -20 sharpening. Again, it's a super simple tool. It's one slider across a mask that's covering the entire photo. Simple and very efficient. You can use it to add more realistic grain to your photos, even though I would strongly advise you to check out my all-in-one grain presets on the link over here. But I'm also going to put the defocusing tool on my website, and you can grab it there, or you can make your own tool and save it for a later use. And since we're already talking about sharpness, you know how vintage Soviet lenses like my body over here have a bit of a sharpness drop off towards the edges of the frame, alongside with some vignetting and some other lens imperfections, but people like me find those imperfections desirable, so I tried to replicate them inside of Lightroom. And as you have probably guessed, since we're defocusing the edges of the frame, this is gonna work much better with photos where the subject is towards the middle of the shot. Now, let's apply the edge softness preset, and you can probably see how it applied a lot of vignetting. That's part of the design, and it also dropped the sharpness towards the edges of the frame. Let's do this again with a more portrait-like photo, and this time I'd like you to pay attention to this area over here where I have a ton of details. I'm gonna enable the preset now, and as you can see, it toned it down pretty well, and it's way less distracting like this. One more time, but this time I'm going to zoom in and disable the preset and enable it back on. And I really hope that was visible to YouTube's compression and all the video mumbo jumbo that I don't know as well as Lightroom. Anyway, we're gonna jump back in Lightroom and I'm gonna show you how I created this effect, because this one you're not gonna find on my preset store. at least for now. So to get that effect, I'm relying again on masking. I have a radial gradient that I inverted and it's covering this part of the photo. Of course, I can tweak it according to each individual photo. And in this mask, I have my sharpness dropped to -80. I have my noise reduction increased. And I also have texture and clarity bumped down to -50. And I also have the dehaze slider set on the negative value. Because of that, I'm going to be introducing light towards the edges of the frame, and vintage lenses suffered from vignetting, and that's not going to look realistic. So instead, I have my tone set to -1.8, and I also have a bit of a contrast drop-off because vintage lenses also suffered from contrast drop-off towards the edges of the frame. And I'm trying to simulate all that in one single preset. So let's recap. I'm decreasing the sharpness, decreasing the clarity, decreasing the texture, and adding a bit of noise reduction. All this to simulate the sharpness drop-off towards the edges of the frame. On top of that, I'm also decreasing the haze, but to compensate for it, I'm also decreasing the exposure in that area. And speaking of exposure, because vintage lenses suffer from vignetting, I'm decreasing the exposure more than I should. And on top of that, to simulate the loss of contrast towards the edges of the frame, I'm also dropping my contrast and playing around with the curves to raise the black levels. I know, it's quite a lot and I'm still experimenting with it as well. So if you give it a try, let me know how you feel about it in the comments down below, but for now I'll be moving on. And since we're already talking about things that I'm experimenting with, light leaks. Yeah, I got a light lake out of a Lightroom preset. That's pretty hard to do, and some of them don't really look that good. I'm still trying to figure out a way to do this more consistently and with better results. So for now, it's not a product and it's not something that you can get off my website, but I'm still gonna talk about them. And for those two people that are already typing that I should use Photoshop for this because this is compositing, I know, but I still wanna do it in Lightroom, so deal with it. The version that I'm playing with right now is using Tool Lightroom Mask, and honestly works a lot better on photos that already have a pretty high contrast ratio and that are rather saturated. But going back to how this effect works, I've got two masks. And out of those two masks, the first one is much broader and is made just from a linear gradient that's coming from outside the photo and clipping the edge. And in this mask, I'm reducing the contrast, I'm bringing up the temperature and the tint, and I'm also adding a bit of orange-red color. The other one, on top of that, is much more complicated. I'm compositing it from a linear gradient that's much shorter in length, and also adding a few radial gradients, so it has these bumps and a bit more of an organic look. And in this one, I'm increasing the exposure and the contrast, and the whole idea is to basically blow out the edges of the shot without making it look like it's just straight light from the linear gradient. And while I still have to figure out the details and maybe fine tune the effect, the biggest problem here is how do I deal with positioning? Because this is a preset, I'll have to bake the positioning of each light leak into one preset. And there comes the problem. Do I allow the user to stack multiple light leaks and have to delete each light leak after applying it if it doesn't look right? Or do I use some of my Lightroom coding from my last episode to replace each light leak preset with the next one that's applied, and this way you would only be able to have one of the preset active at the time. This is something that I don't really know yet how I want to deal with. If you have an opinion on how you'd prefer this to be, let me know in the comments down below. And in the meantime, I'll keep experimenting. But I'll do that experimenting without having this camera on, because this video is mostly over. But before I go, I want to remind you that on my website you find a lot of Lightroom tools, including my color response curves. And if you don't know what those are, I encourage you to check out this video before I'm leaving. And because you watched the entire video, you deserve a bonus. Use code CRC25 at checkout on my website for any of my color response curves. This will give you 25% off on any of them, so you can experiment with some new way of emulating film. That's it for today, and I'll see you in the next one.